everyone, and good whatever moment of the day you are enjoying on your time zones, either now as you watch us live or later as you will enjoy the recording. We are here for an amazing conversation, part of our October series. And today is all about psychological safety. It's about creating psychological safety and how safety and trust contribute to delivering strategic results, better strategic results. My name is Minola Jacques. I am your co-host today. We have Jessa with us backstage taking super good care of us. And we have an amazing lineup of speakers. I will ask Jessa to bring them on stage. In the meantime, I will keep welcoming everybody joining and just encouraging you to consider the comments and consider the chat your personal conversation space. Please do drop us first and foremost. Let us know where you're watching from. It's always a joy to see where Hacking HR conversations take us around the world. And also, we've been seeing that whatever it is that we are discussing, there are so many nuances across geographies, across generations, across life journeys. So do let us know how you experience the topic that we are going to talk about today. So enough from me. What I will do, I will pass the e-mic around, and today we will do it a little bit differently. Normally we do it clockwise, but today I felt like, let's do it different. We will go counterclockwise. That would mean that Mindy, you will go first, and then Pretty, you will go last. And we always start easy. We start with a short round of introductions. And today I will ask you to share with us what is one thing that meaningfully impacted how you come to think about psychological safety today. So just think back of a story and share with us whatever highlights you are comfortable sharing. And Mindy, just give me a thumb up when you're ready to go. Wonderful. So Mindy, welcome. Good to see you. I will just turn on the lights.
Excellent to see you as well, Manola. Always a pleasure. Excited to be here. So my name is Mindy Honkoop, and I'm calling in from Austin, Texas. And I have been an HR professional for over 23 years, longer than I'd like to admit. And I recently stepped into a fractional HR leadership with my company that I founded, Agile in HR. And psychological safety is a topic that, coming from a background with social work, has always been top of mind. And I fell in love with the book very early on, Patrick Lencioni, because I think psychological safety is a word or a concept that people often can get confused with trust, as it's kind of a group dynamic, and that trust, you may have trust with an individual, but you may not as a team. And so I think I really like how Patrick Lencioni kind of breaks it down into a fable in his book and really makes it very practical for a team to be able to speak to it in a way that actually is safe. I like how through a story, you can bring people together and people can share their stories and open up a meaningful dialogue to have a conversation. So I've just seen how that book early on in my career really helped take toxic teams to a healthy place through meaningful conversation.
Thank you so much, Mindy, and thank you for making my job here today so much easier right off the bat, because we will come and pick up this conversation, Candy, around psychological safety and trust. Emma, good to see you again. Hi.
Hello, good morning, everyone, or afternoon from New York. My name is Emma McKee. I am a director of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and culture for a national nonprofit called Perscolas, and I'm thrilled to be here today. As far as just something quick about psychological safety, a story does come to mind for me, a recent story from one of my recent new hires who joined the organization, and a couple of weeks in, after joining our new hire immersion and our new hire orientation and a couple of additional org-wide events that we had, came to me and said, Emma, I've been in my industry for a long time, and never before at another organization did I feel like I could share my home life experiences with people that I worked with. But here at Perscolis, at our organization, felt that within just the first couple of weeks, really felt a sense of psychological safety and safety within his entire team to share really personal components of himself with his team that impacted his day-to-day work. And I thought that was such a powerful moment to show the impact of psychological safety.
Thank you so much. Stephanie, welcome. The moment I saw the topic, I knew we will have you in this conversation.
I think that's a good thing. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So my name's Stephanie Lemick. I am a former HR executive, HR practitioner, and am now the founder of an organization called The Wounded Workforce, which is dedicated to building trauma-informed workplaces. So like Manola said, I absolutely had to be part of this conversation because psychological safety is absolutely foundational when it comes to building organizations where everyone has an opportunity to be successful. When I think about a story when it comes to psychological safety, I actually spent a lot of time in-house in construction organizations. So when you think about construction, a lot of times you think about physical safety. You think about how can you make sure yourself, your team, they're all going back to their families at the end of the day in the same physical shape they showed up. The thing is, psychological safety is absolutely a vital partner when it comes to physical safety, because the most successful teams will raise their hand and say something's not safe. And that's from intern to senior executive. Hey, something doesn't feel right. And creating that sense of psychological safety is not only great for individuals, but it also helps every team be safer in general and build out organizations where the business and each individual can do better. So thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Nessa, you're a joy always. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Yes, good to see you too, and so happy to be here. I'm Nessa Johnson. I am coming to you live from the greater Los Angeles area, so it is still very much morning for me. You may see me sipping some coffee. So I am a Global Chief People Officer for a healthcare communications firm called GCI Group. And I've been in the role for about 18 months, but I have just celebrated 20 years in the HR field as of this summer. So I'm feeling very good and very excited about what the next 20 years will bring. Okay, maybe not that long, but we'll see. But when I think about psychological safety, I think for a lot of us, how we come to know and kind of relate to concepts is we live it ourselves. And I recall early in my career, I had a new manager who had a much different style than I had been used to. And so when I came to one of my first one-on-ones, I had the list. I was going to go through all the agenda items, and she just kind of put her hand over that list and said, "How are you? How's life? How are things at home?" And then that became like the mode. She'd always check in and ask how my husband is doing, and things that I was personally excited about in my personal life, she would ask about first. And I feel like that is that psychological safety at its very basic is caring about somebody and seeing them as more than just their work product. So that's the story that I have.
Thank you so very much. And riding the festive vibe of Nessa's celebration and anniversary, today is a special welcome to Preeti. Preeti is having her Hacking HR debut, and please do join me in giving her a warm Hacking HR welcome. Preeti, good to see you. You couldn't have had better debut partners.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. It's a new kid on the block, and hopefully the first of many more. So my name is Preeti Suresh. I am originally from Malaysia, where I am currently at. I'm on a bit of a holiday at the moment, and it is past midnight. So if I don't make sense at some point during this, you'll have to excuse me. I'm generally based in Dubai, have been an HR practitioner for just about 20 years as well. So I can see lots of veterans in the field at this point, and have worked mostly in the technology space for a couple of multinational corporations. Had the opportunity to live in different parts of the world through work, and most recently was with a Canadian software company called the Valaris Group, and I was leading HR for 6 companies within the Asia Pacific region. And for me, psychological safety, and it was definitely one of those topics that jumped out at me when I saw the topics to choose from, and it's really been quite a personal journey for me. Coming from an Asian, it's sort of like that whole personal story, and it's so entwined with psychological safety. So just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of it, from an Asian immigrant background, where children are seen and not heard. I went to school in the US where dialogue is expected as part of learning process, and then working in environments where I did feel psychological safety and I didn't feel psychological safety. And it's one of those things that I've thought about all the while. It's not just a me problem, right? It's the environment, and a lot of people don't quite grasp that it's not just that I don't have a voice or I'm just quiet or whatever. It's I have to feel safe in order to say something, right? And so it's really been one of those things that's driven me forward and foundational really in building positive and inclusive workplaces. And I really do think that is something that everyone can do in their own way to build these kinds of environments for themselves and people around them.
Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time and the generosity of being here today. And just before we jump into the topic per se, I think it's my journalism instinct that kicked in, and I was looking again at the title of the panel. Enrique always tests me with long panel titles, and I saw strategic results. And this is just one of those expressions that, can seem quite self-explanatory, and we use it every day, multiple times. But I just want to give our audience a bit of an outline. What is the understanding of strategic results that we bring into this conversation today? And Nessa, I saw you first nodding, so I would ask you to lead us into this round of answers.
Yeah, it was more so of a nodding of getting my thoughts together, but I'll go first. So, when I think about strategic results, I think back to, vision and your mission, and what are the strategic goals that you've put into place in order to further your vision and your mission. And so in an ideal organizations, that's very well cascaded from the top. So when I think about strategic results, it's how close did we get to achieving the goals that we've put in place for the year, be that financial metrics, people metrics, the whole gamut.
Yes, the unmuting competition is open. Thank you, Mindy, please.
You're welcome. I love how Nessa just set that up, because in order to then achieve those strategic results, if the organization has done a good job of communicating that at the company level, and the leadership understands, each of these are teams, our executive team, our next level down leadership teams, our managers and supervisors, and have they had the opportunity to really understand what it means to drive these strategic results? Do they then understand it enough of how now do I go back to my one team to have a conversation so that they're clear on what's expected of them to drive the overall company strategic results? And in order to have that true buy-in and that commitment and that level of accountability as a team, to understand what do we need to do together as collective results to drive that company strategic initiative, you need to have psychological safety. You need to have that healthy level of debate. You need for them to kind of work through it together to truly understand, because you don't get true buy-in and then you don't have that true peer accountability without that level of healthy debate, and you can't have healthy debate without that psychological safety.
I love what both Nessa and Mindy said, and maybe it's old habits dying hard, but whenever I hear the term strategic, I think long term. And, maybe that's the old strategic planning, it's strategic planning time of year. So when I think about strategic results, I also think about long-term results. And I think this is so important when we think about psychological safety, because short-term results, you could grind, I hate to say grind them out of your team members. You can push really hard, but when there's a lack of psychological safety, when there's a lack felt permission for candor and showing up as a genuine version of yourself, that burnout is going to come quick. It's going to come fast, and your employer brand is going to be hurt. Well, those are things over time in the long run that are going to really put organizations behind the game in terms of maximizing talent and fully realizing their results. So I always think of that piece too. So often we get bogged down in the quarters and the fiscal year, but that strategic aspect is also that long-term planning as well.
Yeah, agreed. I think all of the comments have been just so insightful and so wonderful. And to think about it on the strategic level, I love that we're framing this conversation around psychological safety with the strategic frame, because it can be easy for people to think about psychological safety in a way that is other than business outcomes, but it really is an important and foundational component of being successful, of an organization being successful. So incorporating this component of strategic into the conversation really helps to elevate this work and show the importance of it for people who might not be close to it, who might not have an opportunity to have these conversations day in and day out. So really, really appreciate that we're talking about it in that way. And to build on what Stephanie was saying, thinking long term, it's about the plan, right? It's about planning and the process behind delivering outcomes and goals and objectives that an organization has. And so thinking about psychological safety as a core component of being able to achieve those outcomes really emphasizes how much intentionality has to go into this work, and that it's not optional. It's really a critical part of any organization's success.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of you ladies. So I think for me, it's the long term, but it's also the question of, are we there yet? How do you actually know along the way that you're on the right track, or are you not on the right track? What are your checkpoints? What are your milestones? What are the KPIs? And the way that psychological safety specifically gets into this aspect is basically, a lot of leaders now we're finding that they don't have the right feedback. People are afraid to say, hey, I don't think that this is the right thing to do, or we're not going to reach that milestone. And if you don't have that psychological safety, how do you pivot? How do you know when to pivot? So I think that aspect of it is really important for achieving strategic results as well. So that's how it ties in my opinion.
Thank you. And with much gratitude to our co-facilitators today, Mindy Honkoop and Patrick Lencioni, let's go back to psychological safety and trust. When are these two interchangeable? And when are these two separate values, principles, notion that we should be mindful in and addressing as such? And Mindy, since you introduced this to us, please lead us into this. Maybe go a little bit deeper into the story that you teased us with, and we will take it from there.
I'll do my best. Because those are two really, really good, great questions. I mean, kind of going back to the story, I was in an organization that introduced the Patrick Lencioni and that book. And what I loved about how they introduced it to become a company-wide common used language. And so it wasn't just the executive team that read it and had this great exercise, or just one siloed team. Everyone read it. And we, as HR business partners, we went into the teams that we supported and facilitated a conversation around the book and leading the team through those exercises that the team in the book went through. And it was amazing to be able to just see how each team approached that differently, And as a social worker, being able to understand kind of one-on-one before we went into the team, I always like to understand one-on-one, where was the level of that individual's trust with each other? Because these can be really difficult conversations to facilitate if you're doing the 5 behaviors or the table groups work for the first time. And so being able to understand it from one-on-one before having that team session. And often if a leader has just naturally had a really good relationship individually with each person, and then each person on that team had a healthy relationship with each other, I often found that that team just naturally had a really great cadence, a really great rhythm, and that psychological safety was there. But if it was off, it could just be one person. So if one person was slightly off in the level of trust, then that psychological safety was hindered. The maturity level of psychological safety was less than other teams, even with just one individual being slightly askew, where they didn't feel one-on-one trust, or there wasn't trust with all the members on that team because they couldn't show up in team meetings as their genuine self. And that restricted the team then from being able to realize and unlock the full potential of that individual on the team, which decreased the level of productivity for that team because they weren't able to fully get to that level of buy-in and commitment and accountability just from one team member being off. And so it was just so powerful to see like, how this work is so important and how you have to think about trust and safety. And each person has their unique definition for that, depending on their background, their culture. I mean, someone mentioned trauma and how trauma informs our feelings around what does it mean for me to feel safe and to have trust. Because that all goes into psychological safety. I don't think you can just go into a team and talk about it straight on. You really do need to understand who are the each unique members of this team. What are their definitions? What is their lived experience as we come together as a team to then inform a conversation of psychological safety? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so very much. And I just saw that Renee, and thank you, Renee, she dropped a recommendation for some other body of research. And I just want to encourage everybody, if there's a book that you found particularly meaningful, or an article, or any kind of resource that has a link, drop that in the comments and do help us build a library of amazing resources on this topic. So thank you, Mindy. Now, who wants to take this further?
I'll jump in. Unless Preeti, I know you unmuted yourself. Do you want to jump in first? No. Okay. I talk about both of these things a lot. I talk about psychological safety a lot. I talk about trust a lot. I talk about them separately. I do think they are genuinely different things. I think psychological safety cannot exist without trust. I think for some people, trust can exist without psychological safety, though. And this is probably a little bit interesting. And I will try and be brief in this explanation, but I think they're generally speaking 2 different approaches to trust. And neither are right or wrong. It's just how individuals are programmed, how they bring their lived experience to the concept of trust. And there are automatic trusters. I'm an automatic truster. There are those people that start from a place of trust. And trust is brought to a relationship, an organization, a partnership as a place to start. And that's where they start. So if you're starting from trust, psychological safety, I don't think necessarily has to be built for that trust to exist. The flip side, though, the other type of truster is an evidence-based truster. And evidence-based trusters are those individuals where trust builds over time. And I do think evidence-based trusters, psychological safety is much more important, much more vital for building trust over time. So someone's relationship with trust, I think, is really important and helpful in understanding psychological safety because they work so interestingly hand in hand. And again, we get back to one is not better than the other because, for example, maybe harder to earn an evidence-based truster's trust, but it's also much harder to break their trust. On the flip side, someone who is a automatic truster, it's much easier to break their trust. So when I think about that, and I think about how psychological safety cannot exist without trust, I like to start from trust, because understanding individual relationships with that become very important. So if we're not foundationally investing in building and maintaining trust, it's super important to be thoughtful about that, because then psychological safety cannot exist.
Pretty.
Yeah, I love that, Stephanie. And I just want to build a little bit on that. To me, it's trust is other oriented, right? Like trust is, okay, do I trust another person? Do I believe that their intentions and actions are in my best interest? Do they have my back, kind of thing? And psychological safety, whereas is something that's self-focused, right? So do I feel that it's okay to say something or do something without the fear of like negative consequences? And it really helped me to understand psychological safety from a neurological perspective, because what and a lot of people, even I didn't know this, until I studied about it, but the brain is actually designed to perceive threats in your environment, right? And from evolution, we've come to where we are, but your brain is still in that kind of caveman type of scenario and environment, right? And what you're doing is, when that alarm goes off, you are just fight, flight, or freeze. And a lot of times you're seeing psychological safety, okay, it's self-preservation. It's actually survival instinct that's kicking in and telling you to do whatever it is that you're doing. And when you understand that that's the default is that you have no psychological safety. And then you start to realize that, hey, I actually need to proactively do something, and it's not a given. I have to proactively do something in order to take actions if I want to, perceive my environment in a different way, if that makes sense. So it helped me understand, from that perspective, what that is.
So I love what Preeti said, and she actually stole exactly what I wanted to talk about, but about trust being, more so outwardly focused. Like when I think about trust, it's like, are you the kind of person who's going to come through? Do your actions and your words match up? Things of that nature. And whereas psychological safety is more so inwardly facing. But I really see the two concepts as being fuel for each other. But I was thinking of it in terms of when we start our relationships with each other, like a new hire comes into your team, you have to focus on building trust initially so that then psychological safety can start to happen. But I think as you kind of pull both of those levers, you will likely see increases on both sides of things. Yeah, that's my take.
I'm right there with you. I had so many thoughts that people have shared as well. So I love all of this. And so I'm just a couple of quick things to add. I tend to go this route when I do a lot of these conversations and in a lot of the work that I do. But the interesting thing about both trust and psychological safety to me is that every individual is going to have their own version of both of those. I do think they are separate things that work together, that overlap in many places, might have similarities, might have some differences. But I think the thing that my mind goes to is that trust for one person is going to look different from trust from another. There might be some overarching themes, especially once we start talking about a culture in a workplace. There's going to be some themes that apply to trust throughout an organization. But again, building trust with one person and building trust with another person, they're going to look different. And I think the same thing goes for psychological safety. There might be some core components of it that are more universal, or that a company overall, an organization overall, incorporates as part of how they include and build psychological safety. But looking at it at the individual level is a really big part of successfully incorporating this in, so that everyone feels like they're a part of this work. So that's the only thing I wanted to add to all the other wonderful comments.
Thank you all so much. And believe it or not, we are right at the middle of our time today. It's just 1 hour is not enough for this topic. And I do want to acknowledge there's quite a lot of energy in the chats around whose responsibility is psychological safety and trust. It started, shy with mentioning Simon Sinek, and then it just built from there. So there is a powerful short video from Simon Sinek on how it is an absolute leader's responsibility to create and ensure it. And just as I encourage people that I work with in my day-to-day work, let's also be mindful of not keeping this conversation lopsided, because there are also needs that leaders have from their teams in order for psychological safety to be wholesome and sustainable and genuine. So I would really invite you to take a few minutes and really look at who's accountable and who needs to show up in one way within a team for that team to be psychologically safe. And Stephanie, I will ask you to go first. And what I will do, I will just welcome people who joined a little bit later, and just put everybody at ease, knowing that this conversation is being recorded, and whether you missed parts of it or you want to recommend it or re-listen to it, you can find it on hackinghrlab.io or on our LinkedIn space. So, Stephanie, please.
I think everyone is responsible for psychological safety. I think it's like culture. Everyone has got to, be on the boat. We've got to be in the boat. We're all rowing in the same direction for psychological safety to work. I think, to Sinek's point, leaders absolutely set the tone for their teams and organizations. So their actions, their behaviors, their commitment to psychological safety is going to have an outsized impact on the team. But I think it's everybody. Because when you think about psychological safety, it's that there won't be repercussions for speaking your mind. Well, that exists in, manager and employee interactions, but that also exists in peer-to-peer interactions as well. And so that's where I get to the piece where I really think it's everyone's responsibility, but of course leaders have to take that leadership role. I love what you said, Manola, about what about leaders? Managers and leaders have such a hard job, and they get picked on a lot, sometimes fairly, a lot of times unfairly, because they don't have the right tools and resources to really be the best versions of themselves and support their teams in the right way. And I think one challenge with leadership, especially as it relates to psychological safety, is there's a real lack of self-awareness around positional power and how your behaviors, how you create psychological safety, how that has, again, that outsized effort on your team. And, if you're a brand new manager, how do you understand what it means to go from being a peer to be a leader? And I think that change is really an immense challenge for individuals. And there are so few resources to help support managers to be successful in doing that, when I really believe most want to. And so then you have this negative impact, not only for that individual manager, but then also that ripple or cascading impact to their teams.
The first word that came up for me as we were thinking of this is exactly a word that Stephanie used, which is power. I think the people who have the most power within an organization should have the most responsibility. While I do think everyone can contribute and should contribute, I feel like, you have to start with where the power exists, and that's leadership. Senior leaders should help their, next level leadership feel empowered, so that they can lead their teams and then pass that along to others. So that's where I would put that. Now, on the point about leaders also not, needing something from their teams, the one thing that I will call out, because I've seen it so many times, is that managers want a chance to understand what they need to improve upon. And a lot of times that's not, really cycled up to their teams. So I think that's where it's important for the organization, probably coming out from the people team, to make sure that there's multiple avenues to give feedback so that people can feel safe doing so. But more importantly, acting on what you hear. When a leader does get the feedback, they've got to be able to act on it. But I think a challenge for them sometimes is not getting a clear sense of that feedback.
Yeah, so I love that, Manola, you talked about accountability as you were framing this question, because that's coming up in some of this conversation, the difference between who's responsible for and who's accountable for. And that's how I start to think about some of these things. So responsible for management, leadership, right? The most senior leaders, the board of directors who is guiding the leaders of an organization as well, really driving forward this culture of psychological safety, and then taking it to the next level and providing specific expectations, norms, behaviors, actions that align with what that looks like for an organization. So there's clarity throughout the organization as to, we can define psychological safety, but what does that look like in a meeting? What does that look like in my day-to-day life as a new hire or as a middle manager, or across the country where I may be geographically disconnected from some other team members? So providing that clarity, and then providing the tools and the resources for everyone in the organization to know how to hold themselves and each other accountable is a really big part of making this work successful. So what to do when there's not psychological safety? What are the methods that we can do to raise that hand, raise that flag to say, we need to do better, or I'm witnessing something that's not aligning with psychological safety? And what are the mechanisms that senior leaders put in place to enable the rest of the organization to be involved in this work?
Yeah, I think that's so important. And then often thinking about going back to, if you haven't visited your values in a while, and then breaking those down into the actual competencies or behaviors that you're going to reward and recognize into performance and management around in your daily practices. If those don't support psychological safety, there's a huge disconnect, even down to how do we incentivize. If we're incentivizing individual constructs versus team construct in psychological safety, you are going to see the behaviors you're incentivizing. And so how do we even rethink what are those behaviors? How are we incentivizing them to also, and how are we recognizing them? And making sure all those things weave back to, is this driving and supporting the accountability of psychological safety?
So I think, and I agree with all of your points, and absolutely about clear expectations. I think what in my experience is leaders are not always aware of whether or not the environments that they are building are psychologically safe or not, right? And that's really, for me, where it starts, like building that awareness about the organization, about their teams. We find, even within the same organization, there'll be variances depending on the leadership style of each individual leader, right? So how do we actually get that awareness to the leaders that that perhaps there isn't any psychological safety? And there was a study that the NLI did where they found 57% of individual contributors experienced low psychological safety. Now compare that with 20% of managers and 10% of executives. So if I'm an executive and I've not really experienced psychological safety, or for me it's like, oh, I can say whatever I want and therefore everybody else should be able to. It's not a valid excuse, and for me it's like, how do you build that awareness first before then putting all of these things in place to build up that environment?
I have to jump in because you're so spot on that there is this belief and this feeling that leaders are doing what they need to do to build psychological safety. But statistics, from McKinsey show only 26% of leaders are actually effectively creating psychological safety for their teams. So this big discrepancy that you've pointed out is really, really key. I'm so grateful that you brought that up, Preeti. It's so important.
And I mean, it goes all the way back to that human felt experience. Like you can't have psychological safety if the humans in your organization don't feel seen, heard, and valued. And there's a recent Gardner research where 83% of employees said the most important thing is I want to be treated as an employee. I want to be treated. That only 43% said they actually felt like they were treated as a human, that their organization saw them as a human. If you're sitting in an organization and you don't feel like you're a human, you're not. It's just going to be really hard to pull psychological safety then out of a place that someone doesn't even feel human.
Thank you so very much for bringing the conversation to this point, because here I was under the very joyful inspiration of facilitating our second edition of People Analytics yesterday and today. So I hope I will get to see many of you in the audience for the 3 panels later. But I was meaning to ask you, what is the data for psychological safety? Is there such a thing as meaningful data for this? Can we measure it? Can we speak about it in the language of business outcomes and business results? And Emma, I would invite you to start us off on this one.
Sure. Yeah. I like to talk about surveys and getting information from people when it comes to psychological safety. So to take just the first half of your question first, Manola, I think a lot of times you need to ask. Now, that's a big ask for an organization. If you don't already have psychological safety and then you ask people about it, how are you going to get good results, right? So it's kind of a catch-22 in some ways, but you need to start gathering that data. You need to start asking. There are survey tools out there, and if you're looking to figure out where to start benchmarking it, doing pulse surveys so that you're really tracking trends over time can be really impactful. If there's really a lack of psychological safety and you feel you need to, bring in a third party to do it anonymously, there are some mechanisms for that to engage that way. Another thing that I think it'd be really impactful when you're measuring psychological safety, I kind of talked about it earlier, but breaking it down further to really help say, here are the components of psychological safety, right? That we see or we expect to see in the organization, and measuring each of them, being able to then really look at it by department, look at it by team and geographical region, being able to really slice that information and analyze it so that you can see which teams or departments are leading in this work, which teams maybe are not, and the why, try to bridge those gaps or identify what's working and what those best practices are with the teams that are really successful with it. So I do think that surveys to me is a really powerful component of this work. It's not the only way to do it, but that's something I'm personally really passionate about when it comes to a lot of these topics.
What's great about psychological safety being kind of a sexy topic is there are so many great resources now available to use as it relates to psychological safety and how you can build it and how you can measure and monitor it. So if you haven't checked out the work of Project Aristotle from Google and all the tools they have around building psychological safety, that's absolutely a wonderful resource. And when I think about measuring psychological safety specifically, I think of one of the founders of the concept of modern psychological safety at work, Amy Edmondson. And if you haven't had a chance to check out her book, it's called The Fearless Organization, or even read some of her information, it is absolutely fabulous. But she has this great tool you can find on her website, and it's a simple 7-question assessment to assess psychological safety. And so bear with me, I'll run through them really quickly just so you get an idea of what you'd be asking. But it would be, if you make a mistake on this team, it's not held against you. Members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. People on this team sometimes accept others for being different. It is safe to take risks on this team. It isn't difficult to ask other members of this team for help. No one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. And finally, working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. And go to Amy Edmondson's website. She has this available to you. But it's so great to have these 7 questions. And whether it's in a survey and you're collecting that data on a large scale or an organization, or if you're a leader or a manager, even just using those questions, maybe not a laundry list, don't put the spotlight too much on your team, but ask those questions of your team members and in one-on-ones or team meetings to get a better sense of psychological safety and really dig in on areas that are going well and those that are not so well.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in because what we heard from Emma and Stephanie is really spot on. Then I would want to tie that survey data to business outcomes. How is it tracking against attrition? How is it tracking against our customer feedback? Our client survey, satisfaction surveys, et cetera. Things that we can make that inference that teams with higher levels of psychological safety are experiencing stronger business results. So yeah, I think that, but you have to capture it. I think that a lot of engagement surveys don't get to the specifics that Edmondson talks about, in those questions. So it either needs to be built in or be something supplemental, but regardless, ideally you're seeing the business outcomes, and because that's the business case.
Yeah, and it's so layered, right? Like all of the things that we've all said are like good. And another person that I love is Jeb Hurley, who and his trust metrics and brainware vault. He is kind of an expert also in this space. And how can we be able to give our managers and our teams that we talked about, we're all held accountable for this, some tools that they can use day to day? Because you can have psychological safety and trust, but it can break down really fast if you're not being able to have those feedback channels to be able to call something. Like if we've messed something up, if we've set expectations as a team as to what are those behaviors we agree to that maintain our psychological safety, how we as a team define that. And how do we, when we see that we haven't met that level of expectation, how can we hold each other accountable, or are we self-aware to call it out and say, hey, I am sorry, I didn't, or I need help. Like I'm coming into this meeting today, really low energy. I know our level of expectation around behavior is this team, I need help. And so what are those tools that we can use day to day and the language to be able to support each other and understanding what are those expectations? Because when the experience of the team doesn't meet the expectations, that's when you start to see the breakdown of trust and psychological safety. And so how do we even break that down into how every day can we have this feedback channel and check in with each other?
So I love that, Mindy. So I did see something on LinkedIn the other day. Someone was doing a poll where they're asking their audience, how are you feeling today? A scale of 1 to 5. And tracking that over time on a daily basis, and then you start to get trend lines, and how is that going, and what's affecting the fluctuations, right? And with psychological safety, it's such a delicate, volatile kind of aspect, because it takes so much time to build, and sometimes it takes moments to destroy it, right? And even measuring that at a particular point in time, it may not be the same a week later. So what I've done in the past is, of course, all the surveys and things like that, but really that gives you an indication of maybe where those pain points are, and then you would really need to have that conversation, that deeper dive into each of those teams to really find out what is it that the survey is not telling you, what do I need to know to help the situation. So I think it's a delicate balance of a lot of these components to make up the solution to that particular issue, right?
So this next question, that I'm not promising that it's gonna be the last, but let's see how we do time-wise. It comes with a confession. I was very tempted to ask something along the lines of hybrid ways of working and remote and online collaboration. And then I remembered someone saying in a conversation that our ways of working at best are echo chambers to deeper realities. So I would really like to ask this question with a spin. I saw people dropping in the comments, how is this culturally sensitive? Because let's be honest, there are cultures who exhibit certain behaviors that other cultures do not necessarily accurately recognize as psychologically safe or not. There are behaviors across different generations. There are behaviors, different behaviors, even across the very, basic introvert, extrovert. But we need another topic to deconstruct that kind of binary lens. So I would really invite you, can we talk a little bit about nuances that feed into psychological safety, and they might be misassumed or misinterpreted or just wrongly mistaken for something else. And I would just invite you to speak as inspiration strikes.
Yeah. Oh, Priti, you want to start? Sure. Okay, so I'll be brief because I know we're getting close on timing here. So I mentioned this in one of the earlier responses, but taking that individual approach to psychological safety, I think, is a great way to connect the dots here, because people are going to have different ways of interpreting it. That cultural component, really any aspect of a person's diversity dimensions and identity can impact the things that help them feel safe, or just the way they behave and the way people interpret different behaviors and actions. So, at Perscolas, I'll just use our organization for example. We actually, in many of our org-wide meetings especially, or anything that's going to be a topic around our DEIB work that I specifically lead, we call it out, psychological safety. It's a slide in our presentations. It's in the welcoming of our conversations. We call it out. We're intentional about it. We highlight it, and we talk about leaning in with curiosity. And a big proponent of that is to lean into people's individual identities. Be curious. If someone says something or someone's behaving in a way, and you wanna understand more, lean in with curiosity. Listen. Ask questions to really learn. And the more you start to build those relationships, the more you have a sense of what an individual needs for psychological safety. So those were some initial thoughts. I'm going to just cut it off there and let other people jump in.
Thank you. Let's lean in with curiosity into this one.
So I'll just share a very quick story of this thing which happened. So obviously I work a lot in the Asian region, and it's a completely different culture, right? And a lot of times it's the Western, organizations where, they have Asian teams and they're in different countries. So we would have these big town halls, the leaders, executives would come over and talk about this and, expect at the end of the presentation, oh, do you have any questions? Do you have comments? Let's talk about this. And it would be pin drop silence every time. And so they're like, oh, these people are really quiet. And for us who are locals and we know like what's going on, they just don't feel comfortable enough to really voice out in front of like a couple of hundred people, whether they have a question or a comment. So later on, basically, we decided, okay, if this is the case, we have a town hall, put in your questions earlier so that we can address them at the town hall. So that's a way to like, okay, you don't have to put your hand up in front of 100 people and say anything, but we can answer your question for you if you give it to us beforehand. So that's a little bit of like, okay, how do you get around that cultural differences of psychological safety?
Yeah, and I think here in the US, we see that even in how people, show up to meetings, people who may be neurodiverse, and, we need to kind of modify our approach to meetings so that they can contribute and that we can gather their great, ideas and comments but do so in a way that's suitable for them. So I think it's like just another way of thinking about inclusion, really, if I kind of draw a line back to that. But I have to say that, I keep going back to power dynamics. And in my mind, I think about the smallest things that leaders can do to share power. And I think that for me is like an underlying theme to psychological safety. To what degree does the leadership share power with their team? And so, it's one way to think about psychological safety. It's something as small as not giving your opinion before asking others for their ideas. It's not to make assumptions, in the question as you ask it. Like, wouldn't it be great if, like, don't do that. Ask things in a very neutral, open-ended kind of question way. And, I think also in how you lead meetings, do you give enough airtime to everybody to have their say? Do you let people actually run a meeting and have the agenda, and as part of their remit? So, I think there's all these small ways that leaders can share power, and that's what I would encourage people to think about.
I love that, Nessa. Like, I was trying not to like do a little dance in support of like sharing power. That's so important. It's so impactful. And one thing I think about, psychological, some of the stuff we're talking about, psychological safety, trust, empowerment, these things are so personal and they're so individual. And so I always like to think about it. We have to understand the lens of each individual we're interacting with. I have this saying I like to use, each of us has a suitcase we're bringing with us to work. And it has all of our lived experiences. It has every community we've belonged in. It has, past experiences of trauma for many people in that. And organizations want those suitcases. Those suitcases include our knowledge, skills, abilities, experiences that make us who we are and how we can be successful in our roles. But we also have to understand that all of those things are going to show up in one way or another at work. So how can we be thoughtful? How can we kind of layer the different lenses of cultural, historical, gender issues, trauma issues on top of these things and support leaders in understanding that so they're able to help build that individualized psychological safety on their teams.
And I love that. I feel, Manola, like every time I'm in hacking HR talks, I always go back to like team norms and how you can make all this very practical. Even if you may be in an organization, you as a leader can create that one healthy team in your organization by being able to open up a conversation of what are our team norms. And that's going to look different for each team. And it's going to evolve as your team evolves together, as you welcome or say goodbye to team members. And that's really like, you have to understand each unique individual, and they have to speak into what are these behaviors, what are these norms for our team. If we need to have a pre-read before a meeting, let's agree to that. And it could be, maybe we need to have Post-it notes or virtual Post-it notes. So we need to start out giving feedback anonymously before we get to a point where we can feel like we can hear from everyone's voice, and being able to have the space to have that conversation. What does success look like? How do we want to agree to come to work together every day in a way that it equips each of us to be our best self together? And then being able to check in on those team norms. Are they still serving us? Do we need to change it? And that can be a really quick way at the end of meetings to do a team health check based on those team norms.
Thank you all so very much. And we have a couple of minutes left, which is the ideal time for the wrap-up punchline mic drop moments. What we will do, we will go clockwise, and in the interest of time, I will call on each of you. So Preeti, you will go first. Mindy, you will take us home. And the question is simple. For everybody here, soaking in all this inspiration and energy and motivation, one thing, and we will not be the judge of whether that's big or small, one thing that they can do starting tomorrow to really grow into this accountability for psychological safety. And Preeti, whenever you're ready, we're good to go.
Yeah, so I think for me, one thing everybody can do is responding positively and openly to feedback.
Thank
I think that is, it applies to work, it applies to your personal life. You know, don't destroy that trust and psychological safety that you've built up, because it can be destroyed in a moment if you say something wrongly or in the heat of the moment. So what I would say is think about, take a few seconds. Thank you for sharing. I always call this thank you for sharing. So
thank
everybody's opinion is valid. Thank you for sharing.
thank you for sharing, Pretty. Nessa.
Yeah, I think going back to the concept of, treating other people like not only an employer or coworker, but also as a human, I would ask everybody as they go through their conversations in the upcoming days to really think about in what ways do they engage the person on a human level, and how does that inform, how they can work together as well. So I would just say, start your meetings off with something on the personal side.
Thank you so much. Stephanie.
Emma pointed to this early so beautifully, and I'm going to +1 on it and steal a Ted Lasso quote for anyone who's a fan, but be curious and not judgmental.
Wonderful. Emma.
Yeah, and repeating something I said earlier too, but just talk about it. Talk about psychological safety. Start bringing this up, and if you don't already do it, be really intentional about uplifting this very specific thing, and making it part of your day-to-day conversation.
Mindy.
It's really about being intentional around how are you extending care within each of your conversations with your team members.
It's always frustrating to say goodbye, but today I feel extra frustration. I feel that we could have gone on for at least 1 more hour, if not 10. Thank you so very much, Pretty, Nessa, Stephanie, Emma, and Mindy, for being here. Thank you everybody in the audience for supporting us, and please do carry on this conversation. There's no conversation where psychological safety cannot be talked about. Thank you. And like I said, I hope I will welcome you again soon on other panels, and I hope I will see lots of you at our People Analytics Summit in half an hour. Thank you very much, and take care, everyone. Thank you.